to this point, and it's going to be rebuilt after it is taken and they're gone into captivity with Babylon. They're going to come back, rebuild the walls and the temple, but it's not going to be its former glory that it has. I think it's ultimately looking forward to this time of salvation and this time of an appointment of God's protection for those who trust in Him. He's going to appoint what for walls and bulwarks? Salvation in verse 1. That impresses me, and it I think reminds us of some thoughts in the New Testament. When you have salvation secured, when you trust in God to the extent that you know 100% based on what He's told you to do and what He's promised that He would do in response to the conditions you've met, that you will be safe, you will be saved. Whether that is physically, like He was telling Ahaz, don't worry about them. He still worried about them, and he turned to Assyria instead, and he reaped the consequences of that. But when we have that kind of confidence, what are we concerned with? Nothing, are we? We're in the fortress. We have nothing to worry about. All of these outer forces that are trying to bring us down, all of these challenges to our spiritual life, or the challenges to the people of God in a physical sense when there is conquest going on. They shouldn't worry at all because of the strength of Jehovah and the armor of God in Ephesians 6. What was the helmet? Remember? Salvation. The helmet of salvation. In 1 Thessalonians 5, he speaks of that as the hope of salvation. That's where we can be bulletproof. You think about David with Goliath, and he understood that he was coming up against the God of Israel, the God of the universe. You come to me with a spear and a javelin, and I come to you in the name of the Lord. He was bulletproof. And so when we have salvation, we have that security, then we have nothing to be worried about. We can trust in God in that regard. He says, open the gates that the righteous nation which keeps the truth may enter in. He speaks of nation singular, but when you think about the kingdom of God, it is inclusive of many nations, isn't it? In the sense that Jews and Gentiles enter in these gates where you have salvation appointed as walls and bulwarks, and they come to hear the truth. They are those who love the truth. They are those who keep the truth. Remember in chapter 2, the mountain of the Lord's house will be established, and many nations will flow into it. And that kind of represents a spiritual figure because streams flow outside of the mountain, not into it. So these people are coming into it voluntarily. They're attracted to what the Lord offers. They invite others to come, and the gates are open for those who love the truth. And what is there for them? In verses 3 and 4. Those who have their mind stay on God, trust in God forever, what is there for them? Perfect peace and everlasting strength. That perfect peace is actually shalom, shalom. It's peace, peace. And it's representing that completion, that wholeness. There's nothing that can harm us and afflict us if our mind is stayed on God, if we're focused on Him. And again, you have still this dualistic consideration of the text where you can apply this to Judah and Israel and how they should have trusted in God, and they didn't have anything to worry about. From the inception of the nation or the beginning of the nation in Egypt and coming out of that all the way through to this point in time with the Assyrian threat and then the Babylonian threat, if they have their mind stayed on God, and what does that mean? Just thinking about Him? Doing His will, right? Keeping His law and His testimony. God is going to protect them. And so you don't have to be trained militaristically. You don't have to be any of these other things, a mighty man. You just got to be a spiritually minded person who's submitting to the Lord, and He grants you everlasting strength. The New American Standard Bible says He's an everlasting rock. He is our stay. He is our foundation. And there's nothing that can shake us. In Philippians 4, he talks about that as the peace of God that surpasses all understanding will guard our hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. This is the peace that is afforded for those who trust in God. And so what's the opposite of that? Verse 5. Are they trusting in God? Trusting in themselves. They're the lofty They are the people who exalt themselves against Jehovah. Moab is discussed in chapter 25 and verse 10, and we noted that Moab kind of stands as a representation of all that is proud and lofty and lifted up against God. They were in that kind of an area where they thought nothing could touch them, and that certainly was not the case. God brought them low. But the people that are being oppressed, that are needy, that are overwhelmed by some of these things, but they're trusting in God, verse 6, they tread it down, the feet of the poor and the steps of the needy. And so we've got the triumph, not just of Jehovah, but the people who have trusted in Him. When He gets victory, we get victory. What biblical principle that we see in the New Testament several times is demonstrated in those two verses? That's one of our questions. Think James 4, think 1 Peter 5. Yes?
Sorry about my phone.
Oh, no, it's fine.
God resists the proud.
Yep.
He looks down upon the humble and lifts him up.
Resist the proud, gives grace to the humble. And that expressed throughout time in the Bible. It's no less true today. The way that we will receive salvation, the way that we will receive victory, is humility and trust in God. And spiritually speaking, that doesn't come from just this mere suggestion that we can't be saved in ourselves, we're wretched men, woe is me. That's a part of this humility and coming to recognize the need for a Savior and the need for God, but it comes in submission to all of the truth. We can't alter that anyway. There's these doctrines that make it seem that the person who espouses them and believes of them is filled with humility, but really what it is it's arrogance, because it's exaltation of self against what the truth of God actually states. That's how we're going to be brought high. It's by submitting in totality to God and His will. Any comments or questions on 1 through 6? Harry.
A lot of this he keeps bringing up, as you've noted in your introduction, the strength is from God. You go back to chapter 6 and you have the throne scene there. When you're given a picture of what God is like, and then again and again this Mount Zion, the city of the living God, that kind of way, dependent on the strength of God. When you see God as He is, when our focus is on Him really the way it should be, then lowliness is pretty natural. Because you recognize I'm nowhere close to that. But when we've got the focus on our own thoughts and not on God's ways and not on His Word that tells us of what His glory is like, then we end up in these problems of seeing things in the ways of man, which are not the ways of God.
Right. You know, that brings to my mind the danger of getting too far into, I think you recently talked about this even in the class, but politics. I've never been, too invested in politics. There was a time I watched Fox News a little bit, but, that comes on and it's always like, what are you doing? You turn that off. I don't want to hear that. But if we just are inundated with that kind of information, and we're so, it's good to have a healthy concern with your responsibility and your blessing in this nation of being able to vote and decide. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever. But there's a point we can take that too far, and we're so stressed about these things, and what we're doing is we're shifting that focus. And so now our paradigm is being shifted, where what we think is everything comes through this lens of politics and who's in control, who's in the White House, instead of realizing, I think it's Psalm 11, what David realized, that the Lord is on His throne. He reigns, so it doesn't matter if they're shooting arrows at me, if the wicked are coming against me, the Lord's in control. So trust in the Lord. And so what we have in verses 7 through 11 then is a contrast of the righteous and the wicked. And we see some challenge in trusting the Lord, because a lot of times what seems to be happening is the opposite of what God is promising will happen, and that's the point. Trust in His process of the way He does things. And the way of the righteous who trust in the Lord, it's going to be beneficial. It's going to lead to that kind of salvation and victory. In verse 7 he says, the way of the just is uprightness, O most upright. You weigh the path of the just. The New American Standard Bible says the way of the righteous is smooth. O upright one, make the path of the righteous level. And so I think he's saying that those who are righteous, who trust in God, God smooths things out for them. And it doesn't mean there's no trial and tribulation, but it is that path which leads to victory. And notice in verse 8 what that includes. In the way of your judgments, thinking of that in the context of this world judgment, of nations being thrown down, of the lofty being brought low, we have waited for you. The desire of our soul is for your name and for the remembrance of you. With my soul I have desired you in the night. I think of affliction and trouble. In the night, in my soul I have desired you. By my spirit within me I will seek you early. Pause there. And all of the tribulation that's going on, Isaiah and the people who trust in God, they're saying that's what we're trusting in, and that's what we're waiting on. That's what stays our mind, is that all of this that's happening is by your hand. Remember, Assyria thought that he was conquering by his own power, and he was just a tool in Jehovah's hand. It's no different from all the other nations, including Judah, including Israel. And so Harry touched on this in chapter 25. When you end chapter 24 with this world judgment, granted it does end with a spiritual concept, and Zion is seen in that last verse. In chapter 25, they start singing. They start singing and thanking God for what? For bringing down these people, for casting down these lofty nations. So what is there to rejoice in when God brings judgments on the world? Well, there's a lot to, and that's what they're trusting in. That's what they're waiting on. They are waiting on the name of the Lord and trusting in His name for the remembrance of Him. And His name stands for who He is, and it's justice, it's mercy, it's grace, it's peace, it's love, it's judgment. And all of those, like Harry mentioned in the lesson, tie together. They're inseparable. And so when God is making these harsh judgments, it has an end intended. That end benefits who? Those who trust in Him. Isn't that the beauty? It doesn't matter who they are or where they're from, or even if their nation at this time is being judged. We saw even in chapter 13 through 23, there's a remnant even among the nations. And so notice in chapter 26 and verse 9, the second part, they're trusting in that, they're waiting on His judgment. He says, for when your judgments are in the earth, the inhabitants of the world will learn righteousness. There's always good that comes from the Lord's judgments. And even if it doesn't mean they turn to the Lord, there is still the knowledge of the righteousness of God in the earth, because God rules in the kingdoms of men. And righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. The Jews had a wrong view of things where they didn't want anybody else to know God. He's their God, they're His people, everyone else is an abomination. God's thought is, I want everyone to know me. Israel's a light to the world in this time. They should teach others about me. And the judgments of God accomplish that in one degree or another. They learn His righteousness. Now, notice that in contrast to verse 10. When there's judgment, you learn something about God. Whether you turn to Him or not, when there's judgment, you learn something about God. Notice verse 10. Let grace be shown to the wicked, yet he will not learn righteousness. In the land of uprightness he will deal unjustly, and will not behold the majesty of the Lord. I think that teaches us an important lesson. When there's judgment and adversity, you learn something. And more times than not, when things are smooth sailing and you're prospering and things are good, you don't learn much. You just keep doing wicked, and it even progresses beyond that. In Romans 1, the Gentiles, they knew God, but they didn't glorify Him, nor were they thankful. And in their foolish hearts they were darkened. In Romans 2, the Jews, they did not understand the long-suffering of the Lord was to lead them to repentance, and instead they heaped up wrath through that time of long-suffering. And so I think we understand a little bit about trials and adversity. There's going to be more of that in a moment. In verse 11, he says, Lord, when your hand is lifted up, they will not see, but they will see and be ashamed for their envy of people. Yes, the fire of your enemies shall devour them. And so when His hand is lifted up in judgment, they don't see, as he mentions in verse 10 in the last part will not behold the majesty of the Lord. They may learn something about the righteousness of God. They're not turning to Him. They're not realizing it to the degree of exalting Him and magnifying His name and submitting to Him. But then they will see something. The New American Standard Bible says, they see your zeal for the people and are put to shame. And so all of this serves a purpose, and the purpose is the glory of God and the salvation of the people who trust in Him. And all these people are exalting themselves, they're lifting themselves up against God, they're lifting themselves up against God's people. They think that they're in control, and they're not willing to acknowledge in the fullest degree the reign and sovereignty of God in the world. One day they will come to an understanding and be ashamed that God is doing all of this for His people. I could have been that, and I didn't. I was opposed to Him in that time. Comments, questions on 7 through 11? Yeah.
I think you bring up a good point there, because I think sometimes we forget about Isaiah's call really to reconcile, right? To reconcile to God, and it's reconciliation. And so, that's something that we learn from the prophets, right? This whole idea that while you have time, be reconciled to God. It reminds me of Romans chapter 5, verse 10, where when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of His Son. Much more being reconciled, we shall be saved by His life. And I get that in this song and in these verses here, that there is this wall, this kingdom that is open for all, that will stand. But you have to be reverent and willing to obey to enter it.
Absolutely. And that's where the humility comes in. Let go of your pride and your will, and let God reign. That's a great point. All right, in verses 12 through 15, you have had in the first 6 verses, obviously, the benefit of trusting in God and what He has appointed for those who have their mind stayed on Him. And then in verses 7 through 11, like what we just saw, you have a contrast. This is what the just do and how it benefits them. This is what the unjust do. And in verse 12, what you see is what the Lord accomplishes for His people, that they can't accomplish themselves. He says, Lord, you will establish peace for us, for you have also done all our works in us. Now that's it reads to me like a thing that denominations would hold on to, right? God does everything, we do nothing. Of course, that's not the case. They still had a part to play, and physically God spared His people and brought them back as a remnant so that He could bring about the Messiah. But when it comes down to it, our part doesn't accomplish anything. God's power and grace and mercy accomplishes it. All glory goes to Him, even after we submit to His will. And so you have this understanding that God is doing this. The only reason we have any peace whatsoever is because of you. You think back especially to this physical component of the people of God and the trouble that they've had throughout their history, the constant rebellion that they've exhibited before Jehovah, and yet what actually happened? Jehovah's will was still done. He still brought them back. He still had His people in Jerusalem, in Judah. He still had His nation that returned, and His will was accomplished in bringing about the Christ. And it's all coming from Him. He says, Lord our God, masters besides you have had dominion over us, but by you only we make mention of your name. We're not wiped out by them, and you're the only one we have to thank for that. Some have different views about these masters that have been over the people of God, whether it be foreign nations like in the book of Judges that God delivered them over into, or whether it be the nations that are discussed in this time of the Syrian period, and then obviously in the Babylonian period when they're carried off ultimately into captivity finally with the people of Judah, or just the idols that are present. I think kind of maybe a combination of these nations who follow idols, and when they conquer the people of God, their thought is our God is stronger than your God. That's exactly what the king of Assyria thought. That's exactly what Assyria was thinking earlier when we studied it. And so you have this domination from others beside God, but now verse 14, based on His action, they are dead. They will not live. They are deceased. They will not rise. Therefore you have punished and destroyed them and made all their memory to perish. Now, if it does include idols, which I think that there is a part of that does, in chapter 27 and verse 9, you see that literally rings true. When they're carried into captivity, idolatry is abolished. I think Carrie talked about that for a moment last class. And he says in verse 15 then, you have increased the nation, O Lord. You have increased the nation. You are glorified. You have expanded all the borders of the land. Where did we read about that nation before, just a moment ago? Verse 2, open the gates that the righteous nation who keeps truth may enter in. What were we talking about there? He kept the nation of Judah, didn't he? And Jerusalem was spared, and eventually remnant came back and rebuilt, like we were talking about. He'd eventually bring them back. They wouldn't be utterly decimated. He'd always have a remnant. But when it ultimately comes down to it, what is that nation whose borders are expanded in all of these works God is accomplishing, and that nation that's increased in the land? It's the people of God. It's the righteous. It's the just who are trusting in Him. That God has appointed salvation as walls and bulwarks for. And so you've got in verse 15 this other concept of, I think, a fruition, if you will, or further thought of the Messianic kingdom of chapter 2. The mountain of the Lord's house will be established, and it's expanded globally. All nations pour into it. This is not something that is just an isolated thing. He has expanded His nation, and He did that through all of His work in this process. All of these judgments, they are in preparation for that final time. In verses 16 through 19, what you have is the trouble that these people experience accomplishes by Jehovah. And so it's quite obvious throughout Israelite history and even in the book of Isaiah that even those who are righteous and are continually trusting in the Lord during this time are going to suffer some of the things that the others who are wicked are suffering. It especially reminds me of Habakkuk when he's speaking about the evil around him in the nation. And how is God going to judge them? And he uses a nation more wicked than they to judge them. And Isaiah or Habakkuk's confused, and he says, just keep trusting in me. The just shall live by faith. But what happens when these afflictions come is people turn to the Lord. In trouble they have visited you. They have poured out a prayer when your chastening was upon them. And in part, what that includes is their confession of their vain works, that they didn't lead to any accomplishment. We've been like a woman in childbirth, and she's near her delivery, and we've been like that in your sight, but we've just brought forth the wind. Can you imagine going through childbirth and you have nothing to show for it at the end? Joy comes after that misery because you have a child. But what if you didn't have a child? What's it all for? What did it accomplish? All that they've gone through, they've not been able to accomplish anything. And the Lord mentions two things that they failed in. We have not accomplished any deliverance in the earth. They should have been the light of the nations. They should have brought others to the knowledge of God. They should have been able to deliver themselves by the submission to God's will. But they failed in that as well. But also notice in verse 18, nor have the inhabitants of the world fallen. Something that has to do with their failure to decimate the Canaan land when they came into it. And that was a thorn in their side going on from their history. Some think that's an idiom for born. In fact, the New American Standard Bible says, nor were inhabitants of the world born. Whether it's one or the other, I'm not completely sure, but both could be true. They failed to do what God said in conquering the land, and that caused problems. They failed to bring others to the Lord, turn them to God. They completely failed. And they're confessing that. They're turning to God. But thank God that He was in control anyway and still accomplishes His will. Comments or questions on that? All right, notice verse 19. He says, your dead shall live. Together with my dead body they shall arise. Awake and sing, you who dwell in dust. For your dew is like the dew of herbs, and the earth shall cast out the dead. Three possibilities here about this resurrection. A lot of people think that it's this bodily resurrection in the end. Some think that it's the remnant, this figurative resurrection of the remnant returning. I certainly think that could be included. But then, again, when you're thinking through this, you see all of these considerations of the spiritual realities in the Messianic kingdom. And that's something that happens. We're resurrected. We're raised to walk in newness of life. I think that it could be a play on both. The remnant returns so that the dead can be raised to being alive in Christ. But I don't think it's this bodily universal resurrection, because notice in verse 14 it says, they are dead and they will not live. Those who are wicked, those who have exalted themselves, those who had dominion over the people of God at one point or another. God slayed them. They're never going to rise again. In John 5 we see the resurrection is of the good and the evil. Comments, questions on that? Harry, you have anything to add to that?
I think you're right. Ezekiel 37 is parallel. You know,
Yeah.
valley of dry bones. That's the resurrection. It's spiritual in its nature. It happens as the Spirit breathing forth upon them, or as God's will comes to live in them. That's a spiritual resurrection.
Right.
Takes place.
Absolutely. Yeah, that would be a good companion passage to look at, Ezekiel 37. 36 kind of sets a stage for that as well, with the Spirit of God dwelling in them through the Word. All right. So in verse 20, you have another section that begins and segues into chapter 27. And so, like I said, in all of this judgment, all of this that's in preparation, and before we get to this a little, in chapter 24 and verse 16, remember, they heard songs, glory to the righteous, and then Isaiah says, but I said, I am ruined, woe is me, and so it's premature. A similar here's this spiritual resurrection he's talking about, but first comes judgment. There's got to be some completion of things that includes God's people in chapter 27 in a minute. But until that point, what do? Those who are trusting in God, He's not going to just forsake them as if this has nothing concerned with you. It's way in the future. All these blessings are way in the future, and you're not going to enjoy them. And so, you're just going to have a terrible time. He still is a fortress for them. So He says, enter your chambers, shut your doors behind you, hide yourselves for a little moment till the indignation is past. Behold, the Lord comes out of His place, punishes the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity. The earth will disclose her blood, and no more will cover her slain. For future study, because we're out of time. Isaiah 8, when God was trying to get Ahaz to trust in Him, and he didn't, and now Isaiah is being accused of having a conspiracy against the king. What God says is trust in God, fear Him, and He says He's your sanctuary. So this idea of entering in your chambers, possibly this idea of prayer, verse 16, but just trusting in God, which would include prayer. You turn to Him. He's your stay. He'll keep you. He's your shelter in all of this. Just trust in Him, because these wicked, they are going to be judged. He mentions Leviathan in chapter 27 and verse 1, which includes this judgment, that He will with a severe sword, great and strong, punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, that twisted serpent, and He will slay the reptile that is in the sea. Remember Leviathan in Job, this great kind of unknown sea creature, sea monster. Some just thinks that it's purely figurative, may or may not be, but you remember that from Job. I think what it represents here is these nations and all that would be opposed, whether knowingly or not, to the Lord's cause to bring salvation to those who trust in Him. But Satan's working in that. That kind of brings us a picture that we read about elsewhere concerning him, especially in Revelation. He's twisted, he's fleeting, he's crafty, he's manipulative, and that's what's happening here in the world. And Jehovah's going to be the victor. All right, all this to bring about the ultimate vineyard of the Lord. In chapter 5, He talked about a vineyard. He did all this stuff for the vineyard. Dug it out, put a wine press in it, expecting it to be fruitful. Built a tower to watch out for it. Had a wall, and then you had the hedge, even furthermore, about the wall for protection. Expected it to bring forth good grapes. It brought forth wild grapes. And then you have 6 woes in that chapter continuing about those wild grapes that His people brought forth. So He took away the wall, He took away the hedge, He let briars and thorns grow up in it. He just let them go their own way. He took away His protection, and this is where all these judgments are coming from. Now we get to this vineyard that is its realization. Remember, you had Zion, the ideal of chapter 2, and Zion, the redeemed of chapter 4. This is kind of the product of that. This is this vineyard as God intended for it to be. And He does the similar things. He keeps it, He waters it, He doesn't let anyone hurt it, He watches over it night and day. But here he says, my fury is not in me anymore. I'm not angry at them anymore. Because these are the people who are trusting in me. These are the people who are following in me. So if anyone comes against me, verse 4, with briars and thorns, I'm just going to burn through them. Nothing's going to touch my vineyard now. As they're trusting in me, I'll make sure that they see that was worth it. But notice verse 5, as Aaron was pointing out earlier, you have this continued discussion of God beckoning not just Israel and Judah, but everyone, repent before it's too late. You come to me. And so he says, let them take hold of my strength, that he may make peace with me, and he shall make peace with me. And so you're an enemy of God. Before you regret it, become his friend. Be reconciled to him. And God will allow that to happen. Those who come will cause to take root in Jacob. They'll be filling the world with fruit. But they didn't before. Now it's going to happen in this spiritual vineyard. But first, there is chastening to occur. Verses 7 through 9 is the chastening by Jehovah of his people, ultimately looking to this remnant that would return, that is devoid of idolatry in verse 9. But first, he says, in measure by sending it away, you contend with it, and removes it with his rough wind in the day of the east wind. He's going to lead them finally into captivity, because verse 7, he hasn't struck them like he struck the people who struck him. That can kind of be confusing. But these nations coming against his people, he struck them, laid them waste, but he hasn't dealt with Israel just yet in that exact way. Not to the fullest of his wrath that will come in correspondence with corresponding to the sins that they have committed. And in verse 9, what that will accomplish is the wiping out of idolatry. Harry touched on that last class. They would have no more idols when they came back. A lot of other problems, but they would have no more idols. So verses 10 and 11 kind of speak to that as well, continuing that this fortified city will be desolate, the habitation forsaken, left as a wilderness. The calf will feed, and there it will lie down and consume its branches. Boughs are withered, they will be broken off. Women will come and use them for fire, because they don't understand. God has been trying to get them to understand. They've heaped up false prophets. They've turned their blind eye, and so they're not understanding. And so the one who made them won't have mercy on them. He'll show them no favor. It's not his fault. It's not his unfaithfulness. It's your unfaithfulness. But notice verse 12 and 13 very quickly. You have this Messianic age come back into focus. And he says, it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord will thresh from the channel of the river, the Euphrates, to the brook of Egypt. So you got northeast and north or southwest. So the whole area, a great big area. You will gather one by one the children of Israel. That day there will be a trumpet blown, and they will come who are about to perish in the land of Assyria. They will come who are outcasts in Egypt and worship the Lord in the holy mount at Jerusalem. So nations from all over, because of what Jehovah has been doing, will come to the mount of God to worship him. All those who were destined to die because they had sinned, all those who were outcast, they'll find safe haven in the mount of the Lord. All right, that's chapter 26 and 27. The questions for Wednesday, 28 through 29, are up here, so you can grab those in a second. Thank you for your kind attention.